Nundy, and I'm one of the co-founders of an organization called Dasra, which in Sanskrit means enlightened giving. And over the last 24 years, we've really evolved to pursue what we call collaborative action. And, more recently in the last sort of decade, we moved from starting when working with giving circles to now collaborative funds and collaborative platforms, and are running about 7 different collaborative platforms in India, all for India. Our focus has been on India, not because there isn't a need anywhere else in the world, but that the need is actually quite significant, the challenge of scale, but also the widening of sort of wealth and poverty, and that there was a role we could play to kind of influence the funding, this new wealth creation in some sense, or even legacy wealth with the extreme levels of poverty. And could we be that bridge builder that is more strategic, facilitates, nurtures, fosters more collaboration? And that's really how our organization has evolved. So it's for India, by India to some extent, but we do obviously have funders and critical supporters outside India. And what we're very excited about these days is that there's a role that India can play, for the world and for the region. I think over the years when, we've come up with this term in our, philanthropy sector called collaborative funds, it feels like it's in its simplest sense, just pooling of funds that then support a portfolio of organizations. And I think we've recognized that collaborative action can take different shapes. One might be a fund where it is in fact a pooled fund, and we have work around supporting adolescent girls that is in fact a pooled fund. But if you really accelerate to where we are just about to launch a climate collaborative platform, this is really more around sort of a community of practice, really enhancing civil society voice to engage on climate change in India. And so that's quite different because the platform engages with government and policy. Of course, it also has funding coming from philanthropy, but a different shape and form as to our adolescents collaborative or even our collaborative in urban sanitation. So it's more around the power of networks and how a platform is a better way to engage on really achieving outcomes. So we had about 13 giving circles over the years that we started. There's a special power dynamic in giving circles, but there's also that collaborative approach and that learning journey that families went through. So we would pool funds and support one organization and really give them flexible funding. And it was a major injection of funding for some of the more successful, celebrated organizations now, like Educate Girls, Magic Bus is one of our giving circles, Angan Trust, but that was very one-to-one. And that's really where our whole approach around collaborative action, collaborative funds was seeded. And our first collaborative, which has now been running for 12 years, is focused on adolescent girls. And that has really given us a lot of experience to accelerate and run 7 different collaboratives, one in adolescent girls. We have one in urban sanitation. We have one that came from the massive migration one would have seen during COVID with migrant workers. Then we have the Rebuild Fund, which is sort of a collaborative fund, but really providing $50,000, small amount, feels small, but it's very flexible funding for 5 years for real proximate leaders. And then we sort of have 2 others. We've just launched one in climate called Climate Rise. You see Europe is different. You see our region in Asia quite different. But I think the coming together and really moving ourselves as a global ecosystem in collaborative funds is important work. And it took us a few years to actually, to be honest, have the courage and confidence to push funders as well as partners to say, look, ultimately, actually, the decision should rest with Dasra. That basically meant that you needed to create a governance structure where there is the role of equity, and it's not actually coming from a place of whoever gives the most money gets the most say. However, in our first few funds, what we realized is organizations and institutions actually need some of that control, and that their institutions require that to some extent. And so one way around we found, which was the simplest, is to provide veto power. So I think For us, we evolved even in our giving circles that what helps and who's making the decision is often both people and institution. And you can't necessarily separate the two, but to take more an institutional lens helps to take the personalities and the relationships out when you're creating that governance structure. So I think there is a difference between decision and recommendation. And we have found over the years that a lot of trust ends up being placed in the recommender. Considering our origins and why we created Dasra 24 years ago is as important it was then as it is now, which was really around how can we support building both capacity and capabilities of nonprofits and build them and strengthen them as institutions in a collaborative approach. So that still is where our work is anchored, and it keeps us very centered. But I think collaboratives provide a constructive platform where you can bring in different stakeholders for which we have typically had quite a lot of power imbalance. But it's our responsibility actually to build consensus and to actually facilitate that collaboration. And one piece that has brought and built consensus is coming together and establishing a set of outcomes, but also coming together and agreeing on what are the words, the language we will use, what is the narrative and the storytelling behind which these sectors can flourish and be constructive in their dialogue and engagement. But fundamentally anchoring all of this, honestly, is trust. And that comes by proximity. It comes with the community building. And so there's a role to be played that we're seeing collaboratives and how they engage with the government and that feedback loop. So it's very much a constructive role that collaboratives are playing. But frankly, to really achieve scale in India, you pretty much have to be partnering in some shape or form with the government. So I think the mixture of funds and the diversity of funds that come into collaboratives is really important for us to think about. And we've seen that as a differentiator in some of the collaboratives that we've been trying to shape, here in India. I think the second thing is building the narrative and really being clear around the stories, but also pushing storytelling, language. And I think the third one, I'm being repetitive, but the role that the community of practice or the platform plays in engaging with government. And that as funders come into collaboratives, to not mandate their slice of the pie to be reported back on. The power of the collaborative comes from being pooled, right? It comes from having discretionary funds that you can actually activate community. Like a girl doesn't need just education to be funded and health to be funded. She needs to have the age of her marriage be delayed, which requires a whole set of interrelated interventions to happen. So I think being willing to not tag their money different colors, but willing to mix it all up and make it like a rainbow of sorts, for the community, I think is important for collaborative funds and funders to think about. So we also run a network now that is of families. So what we've seen is funding move from kind of global north, institutional funding, which is still relevant, to actually now family giving and families in India giving, and first generation, or what we call now generation, the tech entrepreneurs, actually being quite edgy and willing to take some risk. And so it's a lot more optimism on this side of the world. I really hope to showcase and celebrate what we're seeing here in India and how much we've achieved in the region, and if there's more of a global approach to collaborative funds. And there is something special and unique about an Asian cultural context, or a global South, if we can use that context, that can we find that balance that really is inclusive, therefore, of this cultural context, and that we shape a global context for how collaborative funds work. I do the work that I do because it brings me a lot of joy to be able to really ultimately see and be with people who are so motivated to make a difference.